our members, I extend a warm and very grateful welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. 5 years ago, through the efforts of Pedro Boda, a member of our congregation and the Associate Director of Operations at the FIU School of International and Public Affairs, and Dr. Nathan Katz, the Distinguished Professor in the Department of Religious Studies, we began this Good Friday event as a way to transform this sacred day in the Christian community to a day of interreligious dialogue, peace, and understanding. As we hear today about hate crimes in Kansas and in so many other places around this United States and in the world, an event like this takes on even deeper meaning. We here at Gables UCC are so very grateful to the FIU School of International and Public Affairs and to the program in the study of spirituality for partnering with us over these past years and offering us the opportunity to extend hospitality to timely and important speakers, to bring together the diverse religious community of South Florida, and to commemorate the overarching themes of all major religions, that of love, compassion, and respect. We continue to be most indebted to Dr. John Stack, the Executive Director of the School of International Public Affairs and the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at FIU, for lending his support, encouragement, and presence to this event. As you will soon discover and hear, their bench is very deep there, and we are proud to be in a community that has such a state-of-the-art, world-class program. So John will introduce our morning speaker, but I invite all of you first to join me in thanking John, Nathan, Pedro, and our congregation's board for spiritual formation for helping to make this event a reality.
Every year that I'm privileged to come here, I have a sense of peace and joy, a celebration really of both the life of the mind and the spirit and the heart. And it's my great honor to be here with one of the great professors at FIU, Dr. Stephen Hung, who is Professor of Religion and History, as well as Director of our Asian Studies program. He specializes in East Asian and comparative religions, Japanese Buddhism, and intellectual history, Buddhist studies, and religion and social sciences. His research and his intellectual reach really know no bounds. And as a scholar of medieval East Asian religious studies, he is preeminent in the field. He's one of the leaders. So we're so grateful and we're so lucky, Steve, to have you at FIU and in SEPA. Since joining FIU, he has also been a transformative leader. We had no Asian Studies program, and Steve created it whole cloth. He did it with enthusiasm, strategically, and today we have, I think, one of the youngest and best Asian Studies programs in the United States, with an undergraduate and graduate degrees and certificates. He has recruited a faculty, including Chinese and Japanese language scholars. We just hired a wonderful historian in Japanese 20th century Japanese history. But Steve Hein is also a prolific writer. His CV includes more than 20 books, including the most recent one, The Koan Meaning and Metaphor, and several volumes about the life and teaching of the Zen master Dogen. Dr. Hein is also editor of the leading academic journal in his field, Japanese Studies. Dr. Hein is a recipient of numerous awards. Among these, the Japan Ministry of Foreign Affairs Award for a Lifetime of Achievement in Advancing Japanese-U.S. Relations, and the prestigious Order of the Rising Sun, conferred by the government of Japan for his contribution to the advancement of the study of Japanese culture. And one final dimension, Steve Hein is a mentor's mentor. His students go on to do wonderful things. He touches many of them in a way that most of us as professors would hope to do so, but he pulls it all off. And let me say, he is the Zen master of South Florida. Everyone, please welcome Steve Hein.
John, I appreciate those words, and thanks to Pedro and everybody else that's here, and some FIU colleagues that are also part of this event. I'm very happy and pleased to be able to pinch hit for my old friend Nathan Katz. Let me just say a few words about Nathan. I'm sure some of you know him well, but he and I go back to, we met in 1974, but then at some point we realized we had crossed paths and our pictures were in the newspaper from 1967 because of an event we were part of at that time. So I don't want to count how many years that is, but it's a long time. And Nathan, we met in graduate school, and I followed his career, and he was always kind of a leader for me. He was a couple years ahead of me, and he showed me and our other friends and peers the way to succeed in the academic world. And partly, he always stressed outreach, get involved, reach out to people, don't stay in the ivory tower, but learn from the community that you're part of. And this is an event I'm sure he's very pleased to be participating in. And I wish he could be here today, and I would love to listen to Nathan. I've heard him many times, but happy to pinch hit for him. And I would always go to bat for anything Nathan asked me to do, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way. Now, Nathan's expertise covers a lot of different areas. He started his career in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. He's first name basis with Dalai Lama, who he's brought to FIU campus on several occasions, and he's traveled extensively in that part of the world. He's also involved in Jewish studies, and he leads our Jewish Studies Initiative and Jewish Museum of Florida on South Beach program. He also created a Center for Spirituality that has been a vigorous and dynamic program at FIU, and I think today he was going to talk about global spirituality. When he gave me the call today at 7 in the morning, he said, talk about Zen Buddhism. I've since been talking to Pedro and kind of learned about the interfaith dimensions and some of the wonderful spiritual purposes and motivations behind this event. So I'll try to present Zen Buddhism in a way that touches base with some of those interests, and I'm going to read some translations of Zen Buddhist poetry. Zen Buddhism, the word Zen means meditation, and Buddhism always practices meditation. All schools of Buddhism practice meditation, but Zen is the meditation school within. So they strongly emphasize meditation as the key. However, today I'm not going to talk so much about meditation as some of the ideas and concepts that we can learn from Zen more generally and apply perhaps to everyday life, and how that touches base with other forms of spirituality. And so my topic could be called No Doubt About It, or You Gotta Have Doubt. And we all know the famous song from the the show Damn Yankees. Can I say the word damn? You gotta have heart. And there was a book about, where the losing team, I guess the Washington Senators, they used to be called, always losing to the Yankees. And so their manager was trying to get them to act more together. And there was a famous book about Buddhism in Japan, baseball in Japan, where it succeeded tremendously, called You Gotta Have Wa, W-A. And the word W-A in Japanese means harmony or team spirit. And a lot of people contrast the team spirit and the group mentality of the Eastern cultures with more individualism and self-autonomy in the West. However, I think Japanese culture also has a very individualistic side. And when people say, why is Japanese culture and Asian culture and these ideas that go back 1,000 years or more in the East so popular today, why are people turning to Buddhism and interested in Zen Buddhism? I think it's because they discovered something back then, at that point of civilization they were at, that really rings true with modern society, which is to talk about the inner dimension of self-realization, and focusing particularly on the concept of doubt, which I would relate in modern terms to what we call angst, anxiety, despair, but despair, those words can all sound a little bit negative, stress, but that sounds a little bit commonplace. But there's a profound inner dimension whereby we self-reflect and turn our struggles and obstacles and challenges into an advantage and make the most of what has been haunting us. And we have to find that dimension. So, famous modern Western philosopher of religion, Soren Kierkegaard, Danish philosopher from the 19th century, I think he was the main person who introduced the idea of doubt into our discourse. And he had a couple of books, Fear and Trembling. They don't sound that upbeat titles, The Concept of Dread. And a couple of others with those kinds of titles. And in Fear and Trembling, he talks about the Abraham-Isaac story and how Abraham must have gone through this tremendous anxiety and doubt before making the choice that he would sacrifice Isaac, because he had to go beyond conventional principles for embracing faith. And I think that is something, the conclusion is a little bit different in Zen, because some of the ideas about faith are a little bit different in the East. But the idea that you go through a profound sense of doubt and it affects every pore in your system. And in Zen, 1,000 years ago, they would talk about how you had to go through the blood, sweat, and tears. You had to sweat profusely. You had to have butterflies in your stomach. You had to have palpitations. You had to be at the point where you're at your wit's end. And you wanted to experience those things. Not to indulge in self-pity, but in order to overcome and face the challenges and then overcome and come to a point of self-realization. So Zen is famous for a couple of things in terms of its style of expression, which is very unique and creative, and I think people are interested in today. I'm going to read some examples of Zen poetry in a few minutes, but let me talk about something else that's become famous these days, the Zen koan, K-O-A-N, which are the riddles, the puzzles, the enigmas that drive you towards a spiritual realization. And there's a lot of K words in Eastern culture, kimono and kabuki and karma and kimchi, if you like that kind of food. And we're all getting used to how do you process all of these words. And some of the kind of are old-fashioned customs like wearing the kimono that have kind of died out, and some of them are available now in the public supermarket. You can buy sushi and go to your martial arts dojo in any strip mall. And so some of them have become very commonplace. But the koan is particularly interesting because it's very old-fashioned and yet has a current significance, I think. So let me give a couple examples of the koan revolving around the concept of doubt. If you're standing at the top of the 100-foot pole, what do? Jump. You take that leap, very similar to what Kierkegaard talks about, the leap of faith. If you're hanging from a tree by your fingernails, and you can't look down, you can't look up, you can't escape this plight that you're in, and somebody calls to you and says, if you tell me who the Buddha is, you're wrong, and if you don't tell me who the Buddha is, you're wrong. What do you do at that moment? So both of those are examples of very extreme, exaggerated situations where you're put on the spot. And I think that's a part of the significance of doubt. We were talking at the breakfast table about sports, for example, golf or tennis, or points where you're in competition, either with your inner self or with an opponent across the court from you. And there's a moment of truth. We all face that moment of truth in all of our endeavors. When you're kind of, symbolically naked. It's just you, your talents, your abilities, your flaws are exposed, and then you have to make the best of it. In a particular moment, you don't have time to hesitate or think. If you're on the top of the 100-foot pole, you can't start to contemplate, well, what do I do, Let me make a list. Let me look at a menu of choices. You have to act in that instant. I think that's where the inventiveness of Zen rings true with today's world. Let me give an example that's a little bit more ordinary, but extraordinary at the same time. So the common question in a lot of these Zen Buddhist koans or dialogues or encounters was, well, who is the Buddha? How do you tell us who the Buddha is, after all? How do you define the Buddha in 25 words or less? And so one famous dialogue, the Zen master says, the cypress tree in the courtyard. Well, let's look out. I could say palm tree in the courtyard in today's environment, because he came from cypress tree forest. This Zen master I'm referring to, and cypress trees were very common apparently. So apparently he just kind of looked out the window and said, oh, the Buddha is just outside your door. It's right in front of you. Cypress tree also had a significance in the Eastern culture because it referred to perseverance and it was symbolic of sticking through. And so maybe you had those ideas in mind, but maybe the point was, don't think about it too much. If you're asking too many questions, you're not processing the self-realization. You're getting distracted. And the distraction is good in a way because it creates the doubt, but let's zero in on the doubt and get past it. So let me, with some of those ideas in mind, let me turn to a few poems from Zen Master Dogen. Let me give a little bit of background on Dogen. He was born into an aristocratic family, but his mother was not the first wife of the emperor, apparently. Now, these are legends. We don't know how historically accurate. A lot of those are drummed up as they do in all cultures. But according to the stories, his father was probably the emperor, or in some versions, the brother of the emperor, and his wife was not, his mother was not the first wife. So he was born aristocratic and very well trained, very well educated, but at the same time, he had difficult circumstances. And then his father died in one of the battles that they were fighting in endless civil wars back then, and his mother also passed away at a young age, so he became orphaned. He had the opportunity, because of his education, to become part of the court culture. However, he gave that up and decided to become a Buddhist monk. And this was in the 1210s, 1220s. And then at that point, there had been several hundred years of very little connection between China and Japan because of political problems, and Japanese, even though it's an island country, they didn't build good ships, so they go off into the waters. It looks close on the map, but a lot of typhoons, a lot of monsoons, a lot of rainstorms came by, and they didn't make the journey very well, so they stopped going. But Dogen was at a time where things had changed a little bit, and he was one of the first monks after several hundred years of hiatus to go to China. And he went to China for 4 years and came back to Japan. And because he had that kind of cross-cultural connection, kind of a globalization already taking place, because this was the same era that Marco Polo was visiting China, and it was a very dynamic location. He was very innovative in his teachings. Now, one of his famous poems is titled The Original Face. By original face, they mean, what's the look that you had before you were born? What's your true inner self? What's your innermost spirit before you were, quote-unquote, corrupted by this everyday world? And he says, in spring, the cherry blossoms. In summer, the cuckoo song. In autumn, the moon shining bright. In winter, the frozen snow. How pure and clear each of the seasons is. So the title is The Original Face, my inner spirit. As you can see from these images, they don't address that at all. They talk about nature. So how do we relate that to doubt? Well, in a way, this poem is remarkably lacking in doubt, it seems like, because he's affirming how beautiful nature is, and nature sustains us, and if we appreciate nature. But then the irony with the title probably indicates that, all right, I'm not beautiful nature. You know, I am not as beautiful as the cherry blossoms in the spring. I have my own inner anxieties and failings that I'm aware of. So I think there's that dimension that we have to consider. Now, when he was asked about how to meditate, Dogen would often respond very briefly with a poem that goes something like this. I keep my nose in line with my navel, and I keep my eyes in line with my shoulders. It doesn't seem to say very much, right? But think about it. What he's saying is vertically and horizontally stay aligned. Whether that's a physical instruction in terms of sitting in meditation, or whether that is a more spiritual intention, the point is stick to the basics, do the simple things. If you do them right, if you stay purposeful, if you stay true to yourself, if you stay aligned vertically and horizontally, then the problems will take care of itself. So in a way, there's no doubt here also, but it doesn't tell us very much about Dogen the person. What about him? We hear about nature, we hear about the posture for the body during meditation. Let's try to explore more about his personality. Now, one of the common themes in Zen Buddhism at the time was to draw portraits of the masters. You know, I remember my father was a very eminent doctor in a hospital, and when I was a little kid, I used to go and see up in the big hallway in the lobby of the hospital. They'd have these portraits of the doctors, generation by generation, who were leaders of the hospital. And that kind of reminds me of what the Zen Buddhists did. So if you became the Zen master, John, maybe you'll commission somebody on my behalf. Then they make this portrait. But the portrait is very formalistic, very stylized. And Dogen says here, and if I can read this poem, it's a little bit longer. He says, if you take this portrait of me to be real, what am I really? Why hang it there, if not to anticipate people getting to know me? But looking at this portrait, can you say that what is hanging there is really me? In that case, your mind will never be able to be fully united with the Buddha. So here I think we see that the doubt comes in. And even as a Zen master who's hiding pride, this is causing him more doubt than before, because he realizes that there's an unreality, a disconnect between the portrait that everybody's celebrating and venerating and how he personally feels. He feels like a frail human being, even at the moment where people are putting him on the pedestal. Okay, here's another example. And one of the things that Dogen used to like to do was to go off into the forest by himself, as a recluse, as a hermit for a while, live in a mountain retreat, and kind of use that to sustain his spiritual development, so that he could go back and be a better and stronger leader. But even here, he discloses some doubt. So, according to this poem, for so long I've stayed here without worldly attachments. I've given up literature and writing. That's an interesting sentence because he's writing a poem and he says he's given it up. So it shows a little bit of irony there. I may be a monk in a mountain temple, yet still I am moved in seeing gorgeous blossoms scattered by the spring breeze and hearing the warbler's lovely song. But let others judge my meager efforts. So this poem I really like because it kind of pulls together a couple of themes we've seen. Nature, all right? You can't help but be attracted to nature. As a Zen master, you're supposed to be detached from everything, any kind of emotion. So even that pure, seemingly pure emotion can be a distraction, but he can't help it, and he admits it. He doesn't try to conceal that fact. He works with it. He's given up literature and writing because that's a worldly attachment. That's another secular activity. It's not truly spiritual. It might lead to fame and fortune. But even here he says, you know, I can't judge my meager effort. I just throw this out there, let others judge. He had no idea 1,000 years later we would still be reading this probably. I always say I want to bring Dogen back well, Larry King's not around anymore, but you know, interview him on one of these talk shows. Let Oprah talk to him and say, how did you really feel about this? I mean, we don't know these people back then, but what they captured in this poetry, I think, really rings true today. So let me finish off with a couple of other examples. Now, here's a bit of a story. This is going to be a very short poem, and the bit of the story is that one of the famous Zen masters would say, when they would say, what is the Buddha? He would say, this very mind is Buddha, like you are the Buddha. And he had a follower whose name was Dame, D-A-M-E-I, which literally means great plum, and I'll explain the significance of that in a moment. So that follower went off and started his own temple miles away, and no internet back then, and you know, trains weren't so fast, so there was no connection, no communication. Years later, the master heard that his disciple was doing very well in this distant temple, and he said, why? Why is he doing so well? What's he teaching? And they said, he's teaching you're preaching. This very mind is Buddha. And the master says, still, after all these years, he hasn't developed his own teaching? Go back and give him this message. My new message is, there's no mind and there's no Buddha. So the messenger travels very far, tells Dame, great plum, hey, guess what? It's changed now to the reverse. It's an upside down world. You got to go topsy-turvy. You got to deny everything that you've been saying to people. He said, fine, I can hang with that. And so the messenger goes back and tells the original master, and the original master says, the plum is ripe now. He makes a joke, a wordplay on the master's name, the great plum, and he said that plum is now ready because he can look at it from both angles. And he can be flexible, and he can adjust his teaching as appropriate rather than being attached to one teaching. Dogen wrote a short poem about this. He said, mind itself is Buddha, difficult to practice, but easy to explain. No mind, no Buddha, difficult to explain, but easy to practice. Now, I'm still trying to figure out that one myself, because I can't explain the mind is Buddha, and I don't think I can practice the no mind, no Buddha, but I'm very intrigued about the way they have the positive and the negative and build in those ironies as an expression of the positive view of Tao. Okay, let me finish with a poem by Dogen's own teacher from China, and Dogen's own poem, and these are both what they call the death verses. So, if you became a Zen master, one of the things you were expected to do was be able to foresee your moment of death. And you would sit in the meditation position, the Zazen sitting meditation position, to anticipate the death. And there's story after story about that. Whether, you know, how true that was, it's impossible for us to judge, but that's, whenever you read the traditional biographies, that's what they say. And then you had to write a verse. But you couldn't write the verse too early. You had to write a verse just before you were about to expire, and then you had disciples sitting around, and they were scribes, and they were recorded. So the Dogen's teacher, who died at the age of 66, according to his verse, for 66 years, I've committed terrible sins against heaven. Now, leaping beyond, while still alive, plunging into the Yellow Springs. The Yellow Springs was the image of the afterlife or the underworld. Hell is too strong a term, but the Yellow Springs in traditional China meant the world where you go after you die. And then this first poem ends, amazing, I used to believe that life and death were unrelated. So there's a lot of interesting things about this poem, and the idea that you're kind of experiencing that moment of death even while you're still alive, and that joins life and death together. That's an interesting point. But what I'd like to focus on is when he says, I've committed terrible sins against heaven. So the Zen master is admitting that to the very end. You know, there was a famous American poet from the early 20th century who said, one of his last collections of poetry, he said, please forgive all my literary sins. And I think, you know, the idea that doubt stays with even the most eminent achievers is a very interesting thing. But Dogen doesn't quite give that atmosphere in his poem. So he dies at 54, and he says, and one of the things about the poems was you were supposed to take what your teacher did and then change a few lines, not the whole poem. You know, you were more original if you could stick to that pattern and tweak it a little bit. That was the Eastern view, rather than starting from scratch. So he starts with the same pattern, but he died at 54. So for 54 years, following the way of heaven. So instead of committing sins against heaven, he says, I follow the way of heaven. Now leaping beyond. So that line is the same in both poems. Shattering every barrier. Amazing. To cast off all attachments while still alive, plunging into the yellow springs. So he takes some of the same images and rearranges them a little bit, and, you know, adjusts for his age also. But while his mentor said committing terrible sins against heaven, Dogen says following the way of heaven. Now, you could say, well, that's kind of arrogant. You know, why didn't he stick with what the teacher had said with that way of humility? And so my final thought for that is committing sins against heaven. That's difficult to practice, but easy to explain. And to go back to the other poem. And then Dogen's version of I follow the way of heaven is easy to practice, difficult to explain. So let me end here, and I'm happy to take any questions or yes.
I wonder if you could compare and contrast doubt, as you just described, and critical reflection. They seem different. How do you see that?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because you know, a lot of these very important and weighty terms can be defined in a variety of ways and have different nuances. So, but I think you're making a very good point. Creative reflection or critical self-reflection. I think the difference could be that, you know, what Zen Buddhism said was you can't help but, and you should experience it in a kind of all-encompassing way, a kind of physical way. I think if we read the descriptions back then when they talked about the sweating and these physical symptoms, in some cases you might say, hey, they were having a nervous breakdown. They didn't have that word back then, but they did call it the illness of meditation, the malady of meditation. And I think we might want to say that. And you know, we don't want to encourage the people who have a breakdown because that's a very strong word. I guess we probably, our culture's gotten away from that word also. That's because it's kind of unproductive. It already labels it negative. But I guess the point of critical reflection, if I understand your question correctly, is that yes, but take it, it's got to be total experience. It can't be just a mental, on the mental capacity. Yes?
When you brought up the point that no Buddha and
No mind, no Buddha.
no mind,
Yeah.
brings to mind the 0 point, or the point of God's mind, or the point of creation.
Mhm.
There was
Yeah.
nothing, so.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. That there, yeah, a 0 point. When you go back to the primordial point, also when they use that expression, original face, the look on your face before you were born. Can you relate to that original moment? And in Jewish mysticism, they talk about the creative side of God who withdrew in order to bring the world into manifestation. And there's that moment, yeah.
Of no.
Yeah,
Of
right.
0 point, or nothing
Yeah.
but God.
yeah, right,
Creation of God.
right. Yes.
So it's Good Friday. So
Okay.
the sort of the sort of Christian moment of doubt, right, is symbolized on the cross
Okay.
when you have sort of the death of God, the death of this omni-God
Mhm.
that Jesus experienced. Well, if whatever God is, it must not be that, because that God could jump in and save me right now, right? And that God's not doing it. And that's sort of like the theological moment of negative thought and apophasis. And so you have this tradition that runs all the way through Christianity of this unknowing.
Yeah.
Could you say, maybe, I mean, think with me a little bit, or say a little bit more, what's the difference between sort of the sort of koan Buddhist form of deconstruction and what apophatic or negative thinking is in Christianity? Are there differences or?
Well, yeah, that's a very good question. Whitney Bauman, of course, is my great colleague at FIU, and he's taking over for Nathan to direct the Center for Spirituality meeting next year. And he was just at Books and Books giving a book signing a couple days ago, and now he's got to suffer through my lecture a couple days ago. So he's asking a very profound question from the standpoint of comparative philosophy of religion. And I don't want to stray into areas that I'm not an expert in, but I think you're raising a good point. The Christian mysticism has used the word abyss, Ungrund in German, the German mystics, or Abgrund. There's a groundless point, and very similar, I think, to the idea of Jesus leaping from the pole. And Kierkegaard talks about how you have to take it as a leap. And when he's referring not only to the Abraham Isaac story, but also to the crucifixion, which is, you can't understand it just intellectually. It's not an intellectual concept. In fact, it defies intellectual conceptualization. That why would God suffer and so forth, and why would Jesus say, why hast thou forsaken me, when he's the Savior? And you get to those ironies and paradoxes, and it's beyond any intellectualization that you can apply to it. But those cause that moment of going into the nothingness, going into that, that's what causes the leap. I guess the difference would be, this is a bit simplistic probably, but the difference would be, and let me go back to Kierkegaard, because that's who the Western Christian philosopher that I've been reading recently. When he talks about the leap of faith, I think, Zen might say you take a leap away from faith. So even that faith is stripped away, and then you're left with the true nothingness that is beyond any. So Zen, one of the main Zen symbols is the empty circle, and that empty circle, usually the brush stroke of the calligraphy is incomplete, if you've seen that, right? Because they don't even want to assert the empty circle as a. And so that's why, if you say mind, then it's no mind. If you say no mind. And there's many of the koan stories say, tell me what this is without calling it a pen, without not calling it a pen, And then the common legal punishment at the time was 30 blows. They would give people a thrashing in public, So the Zen master, according to the stories, we don't know if they carried it out, but they would always say, and if you speak, you're wrong, I'll give you 30 blows. If you don't speak, you're wrong, I'll give you 30 blows. One of the famous stories was there was they put a water pitcher, and if you could call it a water pitcher, if you don't call it a water pitcher, 30 blows. So so one guy comes up to, and he takes the water and he drinks from it. 30 blows. That didn't work. Next guy comes over, he kicks over the water pitcher and walks away, and he's made it. The master says, okay, I've met my match, this guy is great. So you don't quite know how those decisions are going to be made in the end. And people might say, hey, it's kind of arbitrary, it's relativistic, that was a term you were using, and you want to avoid, pure relativism, because then anything goes. How do you draw standards? But I think the bottom line that Zen wants to say is that the truth is not in words, it's not outside of words, because obviously we have to express ourselves. And we express ourselves through words, through body language, through gestures, we laugh, we scream, we grunt, we say aha, we say other things other than actual words. A lot of times we're expressing ourselves. I had a student in my class this semester who would always say the quote unquote, and finally I said to her, either pick one or the other, say quote unquote or go like this, but I can't stand it. And so somebody in the back of the room said, no, you gotta understand, in the back of the room, we can't see her going like this. So we only hear the quote unquote. If she didn't say quote unquote, we wouldn't know that it was. I don't know how that led from the abyss, but I guess the point what Zen is, okay, it's not in words, it's not outside of words, there's a pivotal moment. It's a very interesting Chinese character that they frequently use. That means kind of a turning point, an opportunity, a moment of change. And there's a pivotal moment where you break through to confidence, whether it's faith, whether it's not faith. they're not denying the role of faith, and there is a faith tradition in Buddhism where you call the other power school, where you give faith over to the Buddha, and you can only be saved by the grace of the Buddha, and very kind of Lutheran theology in a lot of ways. And Zen says that's fine. If you want to approach it that way, we don't object, but you don't necessarily need to approach it that way. So I think that might be a difference. Yes? Yes, please.
So, in Judeo-Christian traditions, Hindu traditions, the going into the abyss and the doubt has I think some kind of connection with surrender and supplication. And from that process of supplication, one then realizes, attains some faith in some higher power, God, Brahman, whatever it might be. So in Zen, if faith, no faith doesn't matter and there's emptiness, how does one get beyond, in this process of angst and the abyss and supplication, how do you get beyond that doubt, that angst, if
Right.
there's nothing to anchor on, that it's empty or it doesn't matter?
Yeah. Well, let me answer it two ways. First of all, you don't. That's part of the point I want to make, because what they talk about is post-realization. There is a turning point of realization, but you must continue to have post-realizational cultivation. You must go beyond, and I think that's what I want to stress with Dogen. Even at the last moment, and Dogen's teacher, I realized I committed sins the whole time. Even at the last moment, you have to face that doubt constantly. So you don't, but at the same time, your point is very well taken. That there has to be some breakthrough, or else what are you talking about? Why should we follow this path? And that is the crux of what's difficult to explain. That's why he says easy to practice, difficult to explain. Because how do you put that into words? There is a pivotal moment. We can all tell. I mean, the Zen master can tell. I mean, I often compare it to a great musician. I mean, most of us can't tell who's playing Mozart the best. We hear it. It all sounds good once you hear the eminent musicians. But then the true maestro, they can say, "Oh, you're playing it well, and you're not." I don't know. I mean, I'll take their word for it. So there's kind of an apprenticeship. If we go to the sports, I mean, you hit a home run or you don't. And there's a lot of bottom line. You make that putt. You serve the ace or you don't. So you can't just leave it all up to some arbitrary judgment. And even in the music, I mean, there's going to be certain standards and people are going to be able to assess. Now, a lot of times people ask me, can you have modern koans? And maybe a biblical version would be first will be last and last will be first. The modern philosopher said if the tree falls and nobody hears it, and there's versions like that. We say what goes around comes around. That's kind of a modern koan. What does that mean? I don't know. A friend of mine from Europe who doesn't know anything about baseball, he was visiting Miami, and I took him past the stadium, and I said, "This is a dome stadium." He doesn't really know anything about baseball. And he goes, "Dome stadium? What does that mean?" I said, "Well, it's completely covered because of the rain and the heat here and all that." And he said, "So how do you hit it out of the park?" My immediate reaction was, I'm making a little knock sound like a bat, and I thought, hey, 1,000 years from now, they'll be studying this. He said, now, how do you know? How do you make those judgments? That's what we come down to. It's very, very kind of subjective, and but I think that's what has the modern ring in this contemporary environment where we're looking at so many different ideologies and theories and perspectives. We got to turn to the inner self-confidence. At some point, we ourselves have to say we've got it or we don't have it. Was there? Yes.
When I was in the seminary many years ago, we had a spiritual director, and you would go to the spiritual director once a month. I believe. And I would share questions about God, and he would always say, 1,000 questions do not make one doubt. you can have questions
Yeah.
without a doubt.
Mhm.
That you're basically affirming the idea there is a God out there, there's a mind out there trying to reach me.
Mhm.
And if I question that, then the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, maybe he had studied Zen at some point, but you know, on another note, a little bit facetious. I'm thinking, Jerry Brown is currently governor. If you remember, those of you who remember when he was first governor in California in the '70s, he made quite a splash, and it looked like he might run for president, or he did try to run for president. But they used to say to him, and he had studied Zen Buddhism. You know, he had spent some time in Japan and had a Zen master, and actually, there's a story that he helped introduce Steve Jobs to his Zen master, and in California, which there is some truth to. But anyway, the point was, they used to say to him, well, what are you going to do about taxes? What are you going to do about education? He says, I don't have the answers, I have the questions. And that worked in the atmosphere of the '70s. They go, oh, wow. He's not an ordinary politician. They all have the answers. And it turned out his questions were, a famous philosopher said, the question becomes more questionable at some point. You need some solutions. But anyway, that rings true. Yes?
Whatever Zen may be, a discipline,
Yeah.
a philosophy, a creed,
Yeah.
is it evolving? Does it keep changing? And
Yes, it does. I mean, I think that's one of the exciting things, like about the Asian religions that have now come to America. And they face a more democratic, a more egalitarian society, different gender roles, and you see this over and over again. How those traditional religions have had to change, but they don't always evolve for the better, unfortunately. Zen, always had because it was based on intense self-discipline and kind of a militaristic style. You wake up at 3 in the morning and you meditate and you chant, and then you do the chores, and you don't go to bed till 11 at night, and that kind of atmosphere. So it's a very good training ground for the shoguns. They used to force the Zen monks to be mercenaries, and then in World War II, Zen has gotten into trouble recently because people look back and say that, hey, a lot of these Zen leaders were all too willing to go along with Japanese militarism during the war, and kind of subverted their principles. There's been several books written about that. So that was kind of an unfortunate side. But on the more positive side, there's, I think, what some of the Asian religions had is a flexibility to adjust to the American environment. So I remember a few years ago I was giving a lecture in a university in Amsterdam, and a reporter interviewed me, and they said, do you realize that Buddhism is the fastest growing religion in Holland today? And okay, that's impressive. Of course, in Holland, like a lot of the Northern European countries, people aren't going to church as much anymore, and they're kind of turning away from their traditions. And so I figured, okay, Buddhism is where people are turning. And then, when I looked into it, that meant that they went from like 2% to 3% over the last 10 years. So it wasn't such a profound growth. But Zen is, excuse me for 1 second, but Zen is a discipline. Zen is a monastic system. When the missionaries first got to China and Japan, they said, the Jesuits, they said, hey, this is like what, we can learn from them. I mean, they're even tougher at the discipline than we are. And in America, it's very difficult to follow that path anymore. So they've had to adjust. They've had to be more tuned into the average person and the lay person, for better or worse. But yes, one of the factors.
I'm just going back to the question of the koan.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of venturing, I guess, about some way that it relates. I'm thinking about asking questions and the idea of the double bind.
Yeah, double bind, right.
Double
Good.
bind is kind of similar to
Yeah.
a koan. And then I'm thinking about Einstein, what he said about any problem cannot be solved at the level of the problem, but it has to be solved at a higher paradigm. So
Mhm.
kind of opening the mind
Yes.
to the unknown, and to just kind of opening
Mhm.
in a questioning way, living with the question, like Rilke says, to live with your questions. If you have them over time, you might get there.
I think that, those are great contemporary words used. Double bind and what some people call a paradigm shift, right? And the paradigm shift doesn't happen because scientists logically say, okay, we did this, we're going to go here. It's just there's a new view, there's a new worldview comes in, and all of a sudden you have to adjust. And then from Newton to Einstein, but Newton doesn't go away either. He still had the truth, so quantum mechanics doesn't exactly replace it. But you're right. And then also the phenomenon that we all have. We're struggling with an issue. We can't solve it. We can't solve it. We dream about it. We have nightmares about it. We sweat and all the rest. And then all of a sudden, somehow it pops into our head. We could interpret that as a divine revelation. The higher powers are God is with us and somehow guiding us on that path. We see it when we're ready to see it. Or we could look at it more psychologically, more like the Zen view of this is just the self mastering itself. Dogen actually was famous for saying to study Buddhism is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And that self, I think, and I always like the French term a French scholar used of, because the pun doesn't quite work in English. Tour, detour, retour. In English it would be like turn, deturn, or detour. So we don't quite have that word in English, and return. And so we got to take the detours in order to return to where we're going. And I think, the double bind forces us into distraction. And that's a good thing because eventually it will come back. So you're right. That's what the koan is. That's why they say sometimes you meditate. According to the traditional stories, they would do it for 3 months or 3 years or 6 years. They would talk about people meditating on one koan, and then eventually they got it. And then they say, oh, guess what? There's 1,700 other ones. Was there some? Yes.
We'll take one more.
Okay.
I just was trying to place Zen in other Buddhist systems that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure that Zen is part of Mahayana
Yeah.
school, which has the concept of the Bodhisattva,
Right.
achieving enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if Zen does embrace that philosophy. And
Yes.
how does that apply to...
Okay, good. So to make 3,000 years of history into 3 minutes, but you're right, very good question, because what Zen likes to do, of course, all schools of thought want to say, hey, we're the number one, and we're kind of the culmination, and that's true in Christianity and all religions, so a particular school that we belong to or we're sympathetic with, it's got to be number one. But Zen's claim is, look, we combine Mahayana Buddhism, which has the Bodhisattva coming back down to earth, with the earlier form of Buddhism, generally referred to as Theravada Buddhism, which is more, transcendence and going up to enlightenment. So you go up to enlightenment, and then you come back down to earth. Those are two trends. They say, and Zen says one is letting go, letting the spirit go upwards. The other is holding firm, that is coming back down and applying practical instructions and principles. And ideally, you want to do both. Let me recommend for those people who may be traveling to Japan in the near future. The city of Kyoto, of course, is very famous as the ancient capital, and still very beautiful, and has temples that go back to 1,500 years. Some of them have been burned down and rebuilt, but Japan, they have a great knack for rebuilding them, so they look just as old as if they were the real thing. And you can see some great history in Japan. There's a temple I recommend called Tenryuji Temple, Tenryu, and Ji means temple, so Tenryu Temple, which means heavenly dragon. Dragon means enlightenment in Buddhism. The dragon was a very positive symbol. And so if you go to that temple, a little to the west of Kyoto, they have this amazing garden. And in the garden, there's a waterfall. And then there's also a stone bridge leading right under the waterfall. And people look at it and go, oh, that's nice, that's nice. But if you look at the symbolism, the guy who designed it back in the 1300s, what he says was the waterfall symbolizes a legend that the fish would swim near this waterfall in China, and the ones who would get to the top, they'd kind of swim upstream, and if you got to the top, they were instantly turned into a dragon. Lightning would strike, and they'd go off into enlightenment. Or in everyday society, they would pass the examination system, which was very severe, harder than the FCATs, I heard. And then the stone bridge is like, that's the bridge of the Bodhisattva, who has to come back down and take the risks to help other people get there. And so that one image, in this garden really kind of combines the two trends together. And that's why Zen, that's their claim, that we're not one or the other, but we can combine both trends. So thank you very much for your questions, and I guess the time is about up, so thank you.
Again, we want to extend our deepest thanks to all of you for being part of this event this morning. Very grateful for your filling in at the last moment. We wish Nathan well as he was taken to the hospital this morning, but I think we have all been inspired and we've had some great discovery today, and we go forth from this place knowing that we are people of peace and we are looking for where we fit into this world, even in the midst of our doubts. So thank you again. I look forward to seeing you. Yes.
Professor Stack, can I put this on my annual self-evaluation report?
Of course you can.
Absolutely. And then you put the portrait up. That would be even better.